Esther chapter number 6.
As we jump into this story, there's a movie that came to my mind as a storyline. Really, it's pretty synonymous with Christmas anymore. If you remember the movie A Christmas Story, A Christmas Story. It runs, I think it runs entire day of Christmas on some channel, right? It's all over the place when it comes time for Christmas. And in this story, you have little Ralphie. I don't even know how long it's been since I've seen this movie. I don't watch movies twice. So I probably saw it once, but I just don't. It's just me. I don't. Very, very rarely. But little Ralphie, what he does is he's always, the whole movie, he is wanting something. What does he want? He wants his red rifle BB gun. You guys are all looking at me like, oh no, Pastor's using movie illustration. You guys all know the answer. Good grief. Just kidding. He wants a red rifle BB gun, right? And the whole time he's like, Mom, Dad, BB gun, red rifle, BB gun. He has the whole spec list memorized, right? And he just spits it all out as children tend to do. And then what's the response that every adult in the movie gives Ralphie? They say, you'll shoot your eye out, right? And then he just goes on through this whole movie. He's so discouraged because he just wants this BB gun. And he has these vivid dreams and imaginations, right? As these bad guys are trying to get into his house. And so he's, pulling the BB gun out. And he's like, oh, I need this BB gun. And then on Christmas Day, he gets all these terrible presents. And then his parents go, there's one more. And they give him one more. And what is it? It's the BB gun. And so what does he do? He runs out to the backyard. And he aims and he pulls the trigger on his BB gun. And what happens? He shoots his eye out. He pulls the trigger, fires, and it ricochets right back at him, breaks his glasses, hurts his eye. And poor Ralphie, everything that all the adults in the movie said came true. Today, we're going to open up the book of Esther, chapter number 6. We've been working our way towards these two chapters. We're going to try to get through 2 chapters very quickly today. What we've been finding is that God has been allowing one individual, this wicked man, Haman, to put together his plan to destroy God's people. We find that in the book of Esther, it opens up with an introduction to the king, Ahasuerus. We find that he is a wicked king. We find that he's spineless. He gives into whatever he is asked to do. He has no original thoughts, right? That is Ahasuerus. And then we find from Ahasuerus, we are introduced to Esther, who is a Jew, who is then raised and elevated to the position of queen within the kingdom. But if you've been with us, then you kind of understand that that's more of an honorary title. Doesn't really carry a whole lot of weight, except maybe with the king if he wants it to. And then we meet Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin, but raised Esther as his own daughter. And then we step into, we meet Haman, wicked, evil Haman. Haman, who is elevated to number 2 in the kingdom. Haman, who devises a plot to come and to kill all of the Jews, including Esther and Mordecai. And it's really sparked by his hatred of this man, Mordecai. Haman hates Mordecai. Mordecai has disrespected him. Mordecai refuses to honor him. And so Haman is livid. Have you ever been so livid that you want to commit genocide? Haman has. And so that's where we step into in chapter number 6. Now Esther has gone before the king, and she has begun to follow God's leading to rescue her people from this plan of Haman. So she went into the king, as we talked about last week, and she stood before him, and the king acknowledged her. He reached out his scepter to her to say, you are welcome in my presence, and she invited him and Haman to come to a feast. And then today, as we come into chapter number 6, what we're going to find that God is working in the invisible things. What it's going to look like in chapter 6 is a long series of happenstance. We're going to find things that just so happen to be a certain way, and God is going to work, and God is going to move dramatically through it. Verse number 1 of chapter number 6 in Esther. On that night, so this is immediately after Haman has these gallows made. If you look at chapter 5, very last phrase of chapter 5, this idea pleased Haman, he had the gallows made. So Haman erects a monument of execution at his house, right? So near to the palace, he has these gallows that are built 75 feet high, 50 cubits. And on that night, the king could not sleep. What a coincidence. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles. And they were read before the king. And so here's what's happening. Ahasuerus just happens to be able to not fall asleep. There's a list of all of the things that are done within the empire. These are all of the official records. If you wanted to fall asleep, you know what you could do is you could ask for some minutes from some lengthy business meeting. That's really what this is. He's saying, this is the official record of all the business that's taken place. Go get me the legal documents. Read those to me because I'm tired and I can't fall asleep. All right? Maybe for some of you, those things keep you awake, right? But he's like, hey, go get me the things that you can find and let's go through those. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who had guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? So Mordecai saves the king's life. And the king here says, hey, what did we do to honor Mordecai? How did we honor him? I don't hear that recorded. What did we do to honor Mordecai? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who was in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Is it funny yet? Picture this. This is what's happening. The king hears, oh, Mordecai saved my life. What did we do for Mordecai? Sir, we didn't do anything for Mordecai. Oh, same moment, Haman is entering the gates to seek Mordecai's head. And so he finds out this. The young men told him, Haman's there standing in the court. The king said, let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so what does Haman do? Haman, the fantasy begins to play out in Haman's mind, right? He begins to say, oh, you know what? There's no one in the kingdom as great as I am. Haman was also a very humble man, right? Very down to earth. And so he says, there's no one that the king could possibly delight to honor as much as me. So you know what, king? You know what you should do for me? This person is you should. And he gives this list. He said, king, you should go get your crown. King, you should go get your nicest clothes. You should throw them on him. You should give him one of your horses, the nicest thoroughbreds in all of the land. You should put him on that. Then you should get someone else who's also very important to lead them around. So it's not just a nobody. It's not just a herald walking through the streets, but really someone of influence. And they should lead him through the streets, and they should go through the city square. Make way. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman says, I would like that a lot if you would do that for me. And then watch what happens next. The king says to Haman, hurry. Yes. Take the robes and the horses you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Can you just imagine the look on Mordecai's face, or on Haman's face when this happens? Haman hates Mordecai so much that he's going to kill Mordecai and every relative of his that he can find across the kingdom. And now the king says, hey, go take and go parade him through the streets of the city. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Can you just picture this now? Mordecai, this man who sits at the king's gate. Mordecai is sitting on this horse, dressed in royal clothes, with Haman leading him around the city. And can you imagine? I mean, Haman had to have been thrilled as he's saying this, right? Just imagine with me for a second. Let's just paint a picture. As he's leading Mordecai through the city, what is Haman doing? Thus shall it be done, right? No, this is probably like half effort at best. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor, right? Haman is in this position that he has placed himself in. But watch, because this story is not about Mordecai. The story is not about Haman. The story is not even about Ahasuerus or Esther. Who is this whole story about? It's about God. Through all of the details of this book, even though God's name is never mentioned, all of these things point us back to him. Because what? Watch this. Watch what just happened. We've met a man named Haman who schemed, he planned, he prepared, he manipulated, he dominated. Haman has done all of these things within his power to accomplish his goals. How is that working for Haman? And what has Mordecai done to this point? Mordecai has fasted and repented, right? In the book, Mordecai did the right thing towards the king by sparing and saving his life. He repented of his inability or unwillingness to follow God for so long, and he identified himself with the Jewish people in chapter number 4. And then he fasts and he prays. Nothing else. Mordecai didn't have this big elaborate scheme. He went to Esther and said, "You've got to do something," knowing that Esther was risking her life, as we talked about last week. But Mordecai was not scheming and manipulating. Mordecai was trusting. And so what happens here at the beginning of chapter 6? It's this series of events that really we're finding the very beginning of. It's going to continue through chapter 7. This series of events that only God could orchestrate these things to happen as beautifully as they do. Because already we've seen that the king happened to have insomnia. And then he happened to call for the chronicles. And then he happened to, of all the things written, hear Mordecai's story. Mordecai's story happened to catch his attention. But whose hand does the heart of the king rest in? It's the heart of the Lord, right? The heart of the king's in the hand of the Lord, the proverb says. And so as he hears Mordecai's story, God turns the king's heart and he says, "Oh, that's right. What did we do for Mordecai?" And then as he hears that they've done nothing for him, he happens to ask who's in the court, where Haman happened to be. Haman happened to assume that the king wanted to honor him. And Haman happened to host Mordecai's parade. Who could have seen it coming? Who could have seen it coming? No one but God. You see, the problem that Haman runs into and the key to success that Mordecai finds is this, our first point for the day, our first lesson from Haman's downfall. Trust God, nothing else. Trust God, nothing else. You see, even as we begin to prepare our hearts for this new study coming up in a couple of weeks, we ourselves have to identify what will we trust in. Or maybe I should be more specific. What do you trust in? What is it in your heart that you say, that is the area that I place my trust? You see, we can put our trust in a lot of things. We can put our trust in a job. Financially, this is the thing that makes me secure. Or maybe a retirement account. When it hits that number, then I will feel safe and I will feel secure enough to retire. Or maybe we put our trust in people. Maybe we put our trust in a spouse. Today is Mother's Day. Maybe we put our trust in a mother. Maybe we put our trust in our children. We put our trust in people. We can put our trust in friendships. We can put our trust in influence that we have amassed through a lifetime. We can put our trust in politicians. Don't do that one, okay? Of all things, don't do that one, right? We can put our trust in any number of places. But let me tell you, through the Word of God, what do we find? Our trust belongs in no one except God. Because even if you were the most brilliant person on the face of the planet, even if you were the most influential person in the world, you can't trust yourself. You can't trust yourself, can you? Because the Bible teaches that we are all sinful. We've all sinned, come short of the glory of God. And even on top of all of this, we are finite, aren't we? That means this, we have limits. We have limits. That's why we can't say yes to everything. How many of you in this room right now, you are also at home? No one lives here? No. You can only be in one place at a time. You can't be everywhere at once. You also can't comprehend everything at once. It takes time for us to learn new things. Here's what that means. That means that there are things, there are people, there are places, there are concepts that are outside of our ability to understand. You know who that's not true of? God. God has never been surprised. Does it surprise you to hear that? God's never been caught off guard. There's never been someone who has brought to God and said, hey, you know what? I have this great idea. And God said, oh, wow, I have never thought about that before. Man, what would I do without you? It's never happened. But instead, in our flesh, so many times we want to throw Haman under the bus, don't we? And he's a wicked man. We should condemn that in every way possible. At the same time, what is Haman really guilty of doing? Of trusting in himself. But we're not that different than Haman. Hopefully in the genocide thing we are. But we're not that different than Haman in that we like to trust ourselves too, don't we? We like to say, you know what? I can take care of this. How many times do we take a course of action? Do we make plans? Do we take a step without praying about it? Without thinking about what does the Word of God say in this situation? Every time we do that, we're failing to consult God, are we not? But church, we're to trust God. Nothing else. You see, Jesus would liken this, he would liken himself to a rock. And he tells this parable of the wise man that when he built his house upon it. That house is a symbol of your life, of what you have. And he likens himself to this rock. Because when the rain of life, when the storms of life begin to fall, what happens to the rock? It gets wet, right? And then what does he say of the foolish man? He says the foolish man goes and, oh wow, he builds his life on sand. Well, if you've ever been to the beach and it begins to rain while you're making your sandcastle, what happens to that sandcastle? It just crumbles, right? The water goes into it, it absorbs it, and it just begins to fall apart. So is your life when it's built on anything but Christ, when you're trusting anything other than Him. You see, everything else that we would place our faith in is temporary. It is finite. It can be taken away from us. So we trust no one or nothing but God. Trust God, nothing else. Well, let's keep moving here today. Look at verse number 12. Verse number 12. So the parade is done. Haman is finally free to go, and he is just, imagine the mental space that you would be in if you had just had to do what Haman just had to do. And especially if you were as egocentric as Haman. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. So what is he doing? This is the most humiliating thing that's ever happened to me. He is literally in mourning. He is crying. He is weeping. He throws his hood up, all right, so no one can see him, puts his head down, and he finds his way back home. right? That's what Haman is up to. So as soon as he's done, as soon as he can check out, he throws the bridle at some servant and he storms home mourning. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. That, can you believe that Ahasuerus would have me to do this? Can you believe that this would happen? Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Anyone need an encourager like that in their life? They come to this realization, the Jewish people, you're messing with them. That's a bad idea. Because the God whom they worshiped is the invisible God. The one that nothing gets past. The one who's always working behind the scenes. The one whose hand is always on what is taking place. And so they say, Haman, if that's who you're going against, you don't stand a chance. And what happens next? While they were yet talking with him. So as these words are falling from their lips, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. What we're going to find is that the rest of the story, we've already kind of entered into it. I was talking with our deacons this morning, and I told them, I said, today's chapters of the Word of God that we're in, it's like Haman has walked and waited in line for a roller coaster, right? How many of you guys have ever been with someone who's afraid of roller coasters before? How many of you are afraid of roller coasters? Oh, you are that person. Okay. When you get to the line, you step onto the coaster. Or maybe it's someone who's new to it. And so they don't know that they're afraid of coasters. They just think that looks like fun. And so they go in, they sit down in the car. And then the latch closes, right? And so far, you know what? We're doing okay. I think this was Haman kind of at the beginning of chapter 6 where he's like, okay, that's not how I wanted it to go, but you know what? It's fine. And then that coaster begins to move and it goes up and up and up and up and up. And Haman now he's committed. He's moving. He is doing the thing. And then the roller coaster gets to the top. And when the roller coaster gets to the top, there's this funny thing that happens. It's no longer being controlled by the operators, right? It's about to hit a release, and it's about to go. And at the beginning of chapter number 6, coming into this portion right here, Haman is on this roller coaster. But now he's at the top, and he's saying, wait, can I get off? But it's too late for Haman. The decisions have already been made. God is already working. He is already orchestrating and already bringing to ruin the plans and the plot of Haman. And so now we find the coaster at the top of the hill, and then immediately comes crashing down as these servants come in and they come to Haman and they say this: it's time to go to the feast that Esther has prepared. So they drag him back to the palace. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request." What's she saying? She's saying, here's my request. It's very simple, actually. I would like to live, and I would like my people to live. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Now remember, does she actually mean this statement? It's hard to tell. Ahasuerus is kind of an egotistical maniac of his own right? And so she's appealing to Ahasuerus. She's saying, if it were only to sell us into slavery, it wouldn't have even been worth bothering you, O great king. Then King Ahasuerus says to Esther, Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. The secret is out. Haman has sought to kill King Esther, and now Esther is bringing this to Ahasuerus' attention. And Haman is already aware that things are not going his way. And so what is his immediate response to Esther's words? Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So this morning, we're going to trust God, nothing else. And we're going to fear God and no one else. Fear God, no one else. You see, Haman feared himself, meaning that he respected himself. Haman probably feared the king because he was afraid of his life. He loved his life. Mordecai and Esther, we find that for much of their life, they have lived in fear. They were fearful of one thing or another. They were afraid to be found out as being Jewish. But then what we find that they confront Ahasuerus, don't they? They have to get over this fear of fearing Ahasuerus, of fearing Haman. Instead, they choose rather to obey and to fear God. Because understand this, every power that is on this planet is subject to him. Here's what that means. That means that if you fear one person, if you fear someone else over God, then when it comes time to obey God or to obey that individual or obey that institution, we are going to choose that person every time. But we don't fear them. We don't fear them. The fear of man, the Bible says, brings a snare. It's a trap. It's a trap. It looks good. We build up reasons why we should fear this or fear that. But at the end of the day, it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Because if we fear what others think, if we fear what others believe about us to be true, instead of fearing God, it puts us in the place that we're trusting something else instead of trusting him. It puts us in a situation where you have to live for the approval of someone else. You have to live for someone else to look at you and to approve of your life and to give their stamp and say, yeah, you did it. But the fact is, if you and I fear God, God's the one who, number one, knows the truth about you. God knows the truth about you. He doesn't have to wonder. You don't have to put on appearances for God. In fact, you can't. And so you don't have to perform. You don't have to do these things outwardly so that God looks at you and says, I approve of that. God knows you. God sees you. It goes beyond the superficial. So first of all, God knows you. Second, he's already approved of you through Christ. He's already accepted you through Christ. You see, you cannot be good enough to get to God. You cannot be good enough to get to God. That's why Jesus came. He came and he lived a perfect life. He always did the things that pleased the Father, the book of John records. And then he gave himself as a sacrifice for our sins. Jesus in my place. That's the gospel. And he rose again 3 days later. And we put our faith in him because we don't fear men. We don't even fear those that can destroy this body. Did you think about that? We don't even fear those who can take this life away from me. You know who we do fear? We fear the one who can destroy both body and soul. We fear the one before whom we stand either condemned or justified. We fear him. We fear the one that is above all, above every other name. That's the one that we fear. But understand this, when we fear God, we don't have to fear others. We're freed from that fear. When our eyes are on him and he's the one that we are looking to, he's the one that we are lifting up. When God is big, the opinions of others, the opinions of people, those become small. Because we are able to get the proper perspective. And so we find that we can trust God, nothing else, that we should fear God and no one else. And then look with me at chapter 7, verse number 7. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace. And this is a big deal for him because Ahasuerus is kind of a wine drink. It's kind of like his thing, right? So he gets up and he stops drinking. Okay, that's a big win for Ahasuerus. He went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. Wow, how the tables turn, right? Because instead of plotting to kill, now he is begging for his life. For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Observant guy, this Haman. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine. As Haman was falling on the couch, this couldn't be written any more perfect, right? Because what's happening? As Haman is falling on the couch where Esther was. So the king goes out to the garden, because this is a private dinner, just Haman, the queen, and the king. And so he goes out to the garden, guards, come with me, storms back in. When he opens the doors again, he finds Haman crawling over the couch at Esther. And so what does he think is going on? Watch what he says. He tells you what he thinks. Will he even assault the queen and my presence in my own house? And so Haman's just trying to beg for his life. He's just trying to plead and grovel. And then what happens? Ahasuerus bursts the doors back open. He says, you're going to assault her now on top of everything else? And Haman's just like, no, you've got the wrong idea. But before the words can even come out of his mouth, watch what happens. As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance to the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And so they're saying, hey, you know what, king? I noticed on my way into work this morning that over at Haman's house, it was just built last night, over at Haman's house, there's this gallows. I mean, the thing's huge. I bet we could make use of it. And the king says, hey, that's a great idea. Hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. You see, once the ride began, it was too late to get off. For months, Haman had been scheming. Haman had been planning. Haman had been manipulating. He had been dominating. He had been going in saying, this is how it's going to happen. My plan is coming together. And he's watching as things fall into place, so he thinks. And then finally, he becomes so outraged at Mordecai and at Mordecai's insolence that he says, you know what? We're going to take the final steps and we're going to get this thing all in place. Go out there, prepare me a gallows. Tomorrow we're going to hang Mordecai on that. And he was absolutely right that tomorrow there would be a hanging on the gallows. The thing that he was a little off in is who would be hanging. And so he says, we're going to build this gallows. And then just this roller coaster takes place with Haman, where he goes in to see the king, and the king calls him in, and the parade, all of a sudden now he has to go. He's leading Mordecai around. He goes from the court to the king, to Mordecai, to his home, back to the king, and to the feast, to the gallows. See, God caused this weapon to return on himself. Once the ride began, it was too late to get off. He took the weapon of his choice, aimed it at the people of God, pulled the trigger, and shot himself. You see, church, this is a message to the enemies of God. This is a message to those who would seek to work against him. Let the enemies of God beware. Let the enemies of God beware. You see, the Bible tells us, Matthew chapter number 16, Jesus' words, and he says that he will build his church. He says, as I build this church, the gates of hell will not stand against it. But listen to me, church. What does he say? He says the gates of hell will not stand against it. Does he say the siege weapons of hell will not stand against the church? No, he says the gates of hell. What are the gates of hell? What are gates used for? Gates are used for defense, aren't they? Gates are used so that others can't come in and take ground. But as Jesus speaks of the church, he says the gates of hell, my enemies, They need to beware because the gates of hell will not stand against it. Here's what that means. There's no place to hide from the work that I am doing, Jesus says. There's nowhere that you can go where you can encapsulate yourself and feel like, now I am safe because these gates are protecting me. No, if you're an enemy of God, if you have placed yourself against him, no, he is coming. You see, Jesus came into the earth. It wasn't just enough for Jesus to sit in heaven and say, you know what, I'm not going to let hell in here. I'm not going to let hell into heaven. That's enough for me. He can have the world. He can have the earth. It's fine. That wasn't enough for God. He sent his son Jesus to come to take ground and to fight against the enemy of God. And aren't we glad that he did? Because we're rescued by that. We are saved by that. We are made whole by that. If Jesus saw fit just to stay in his own territory and to stay away and to stay where it's just us holy folk, he would not have come for us. But that's not the heart of God. That's not the heart of God. The heart of God pursues his people and defeats his enemies. And that's where we see this come in. Esther chapter number 7. God has come in and God has said, hey, I'm going to protect my people. I'm going to do good for my people. And that means I'm going to fight against those who oppose them and who oppose me. You see, church, God is on the move. We don't always see it with our eyes, do we? We don't always see the physical manifestations of it. But that doesn't mean that God is not moving and that God is not working. You see, the church is at its strongest when it's taking ground. God did not merely defend Mordecai from Haman's attacks, did he? God didn't say, don't worry, Mordecai, I'm going to make sure that they fail. I'll get you into hiding. I'll take care of Esther. I'll protect you guys. It wasn't enough for God just to protect his people, but instead he turned the weapon of the enemy back on himself. So you see, church, what does this give us? We trust nothing but God. We fear no one but God. And watch this. Watch this. We are able to go forward knowing that we are walking in obedience to him. The enemy can't stop us when God's for us. The enemy can't put up a wall that we can't get past when God's for us. If we are obeying him, if we're moving forward in obedience, if we're pursuing him, let the enemies of God beware. God will take care of those things. He'll take care of those details. So I don't know what fears you have today. I don't know what's burdening you today, but I know we all have them, don't we? We all hurt. We're all afraid. We all have those things. We're weak. But let me encourage you, church. Whatever your trust is in, whatever you're fearing, give it up. Give it to God, because he's going to do a work in his time and in his way. And just like we read here in the book of Esther, just as we look at the story and we marvel at what God did to Haman. Hey, that can happen in your life too. And it will happen in your life too. You'll look around after a life of trusting God and you'll marvel. Wow, God, how did we even get here? Wow, God, I didn't see how you would work these things out, but you did. But you did. You see, God is still working today. The same invisible God that came in and intervened in Esther's story is still working in our hearts and our lives today. So what do you trust? Who do you fear? I hope you know the answer to that question.